First, I just want to say thank you to Elizabeth and thank you to the other amazing women who are presenting tonight. To be included in this group of women is really a very humbling experience, so thank you. I first used heroin in 1991. It was the summer before my junior year in high school. I was 15 years old. It was a typical teenage house party. Someone knew someone and got a keg. Some dude showed up with some crappy weed, and there was a girl just crying in the kitchen. You know, it was a typical high school party. My boyfriend Brian and I were already big fans of booze and pot, and we had tried acid and coke. And when we found out that there was a guy in the upstairs bathroom selling pinner lines of smack for only $10 each, we were totally down for trying it. I was really surprised the first time I saw heroin. It was bright white, and very powdery, almost the consistency of icing sugar. The dealer handed us a small section of blue lined notebook paper that was rolled into a straw and held together with a piece of Scotch tape. Brian did his line first, and I watched his face. And within seconds, I could tell that the heroin was taking effect. A big smile came across his face. He started to rock back and forth, and his eyes went up in his head. And he made what we later came to call the heroin moan. It sounds kind of like, if I had heroin, I could do it really good. Then it was my turn. And as soon as I snorted that first pinner line, I knew that I had just met the best friend that I would ever have in my entire life. She made me feel beautiful. She made me feel funny. She made me feel sexy. She made every negative thought and every sad feeling just fade away. Needless to say, Brian and I became really big fans of heroin. And within a year, it was a daily part of our lives. I had met Brian when I was 13 years old. He was 16. I thought he was the most beautiful boy I'd ever seen in my life. And even though we were very young, we had an instant connection, and there was no denying that. We were immediately inseparable. So my relationship with my parents was immediately strained, but I really didn't care. 2.5 years after I met Brian, and just 7 months after that first pinner of smack, I left my parents' house. Over the years, my parents and I have disagreed on exactly what happened. I've always said I moved my ass out of their house. They've always said they kicked my ass out of their house. But whatever it was, the fact is that I stopped living with them. Brian signed a lease on an adorable little 2-bedroom house, and we moved in. I had a job, and I still went to high school every single day. I planned my class schedule carefully, and I graduated a year early. It was 1992. I was 16 years old, and I was doing heroin every single day. As the months went on, Brian and I had to work out different heroin issues. Our dealers would get popped and go to jail. An importer would be raided. But most importantly, in the 90s, heroin was having a social resurgence, so the prices skyrocketed. Despite our best efforts, it got impossible for us to afford the dry smack that we always used. that was when we started shooting up. It was a good financial decision, actually, because we would only use about half as much dope as we would just snorting or smoking it. I mean, it's not like we were addicts. We were just users making a smart financial decision. The months continued, and I wasn't able to just shoot up a couple times a day anymore. Physically and emotionally, I needed to get high multiple times a day. And so did Brian. At that point, we couldn't afford our heroin use. Not at all, not the way it had been. We had to find a reasonable alternative. And because it was in the days before opioids, the alternative we chose was black tar heroin. Once I started cooking and shooting cheap-ass, nasty black tar heroin, I knew I was a drug addict. But by then, I really didn't care. I didn't care because I was a good drug addict. Despite my almost hourly need to get high, I was a fully functional member of society. I had a job I went to every day. I had friends that I hung out with, and I was still talking to my parents. I was also in a long-term committed relationship with someone, but he was a good addict too. Brian and I paid our rent on time. We kept our house and yard clean. We were even friendly to our neighbors. We never committed crimes. We didn't steal. We didn't sell family heirlooms for dope money. We were good drug addicts, and we supported our habit the way every good drug addict does. We were dealers. You name it, we sold it. Pot, shrooms, acid, coke, X, Special K, heroin. I could keep going on. There were a lot. We were popular dealers. We never screwed our clients and never really cared about a profit. We had one goal and one goal only, and that was just to make enough money to sustain our habits. Our habits had become very serious drug habits. I was born in the 1970s, but I won't tell you exactly what year. So I'm a child of the AIDS crisis. I had been taught about safe sex my entire life. My parents made sure I was taught about safe sex. Even my school made sure I was taught about safe sex. I was in 6th grade sex ed putting condoms on fruit. I knew all of it. I knew how to stay safe, and I knew why staying safe was important. But as I got older, and my sole purpose in life was to get and stay high, sexual responsibility just stopped being a priority. I didn't think about HIV/AIDS. I didn't think about STIs. I didn't think about unintended pregnancy. Those were issues for other people. Then the day came when I had to deal with one of those other people's issues. I had suspected that I was pregnant for a couple of weeks. I had been nauseous and bloated and just felt off, different from a regular period. So Brian and I went down to Planned Parenthood and had a test. Brian was convinced that I wasn't pregnant, and I wanted to be convinced that I wasn't pregnant. I peed in the cup and waited in the lobby. Finally, they called my name, and I went back to the small room. As soon as the nurse came in, I knew what she was going to say. I could tell by her facial expression. I could tell by her cadence. It was 1995. I was 19 years old. I was a drug addict, and I was pregnant. Being born in, all right, here's honesty, 1975. I've been blessed to never know life without access to safe and legal abortion. Abortion has always been an option for me. And honestly, it was an option that I took for granted. When I left that small room, I didn't need to contemplate my situation. I didn't need to talk to friends. I didn't need to make a pro and con list. There was never a question in my mind or in my heart what decision I was going to make. I knew I was going to have an abortion, and I knew that I could have one. Bless you. I was given the contact info to a clinic there in town, and I made the first available appointment. I don't really remember much about my abortion. I remember that it was raining, and I remember that there were protesters outside the clinic. I remember cooking and shooting in the car before I went in. Not a lot, just enough to make sure I wasn't dope sick, because you certainly didn't want the doctors in there to know that you used. I remember that I had to have a counseling session because the state had just started to require that women needed to be aware of what they were doing, because obviously we made decisions like abortion on a whim. You know, have your eyebrows waxed, have an abortion. I remember that the procedure room had lavender walls, and I remember that it had low lighting. I remember that there was a wonderful, compassionate woman in the room who I asked to hold my hand during the procedure. I remember the confidence and security and empathy in her grip. And I remember her talking to me about the new Disney movie that had just come out, Beauty and the Beast. I remember that the doctor who performed my abortion had a very deep and soothing voice. I remember the pinch of the injection into my cervix. And I remember that the procedure as a whole didn't take very long. When it was over, the woman who held my hand put a maxi pad in my underwear and helped me into a warm, white leather recliner to recover. My abortion was as positive and as simple an experience as it could have been. After an hour or so, I left recovery, expecting to see Brian in the waiting room, but he wasn't there. At some point, he had decided to go out to the car to get high and had passed out. It really didn't even bother me because it seemed actually perfectly reasonable. Had the situation been reversed, I probably would have gone out to the car to get high too. I got into the car. I remember I cooked up a pretty spoon of black tar and shot it. Finally feeling back to normal. Brian and I drove a couple blocks and had lunch. I went home, relaxed on the couch, and watched TV. The next day, life continued as usual. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel shame. My abortion was not a traumatic experience. My abortion didn't change anything about the life I was living. As the months and years went on, I not only continued in my addiction, but I got even deeper into it. And then life started to get really dark. First, I had an OD scare. I woke up in the ER one afternoon after shooting up some especially nasty tar. It freaked me out at first, but very quickly, it just turned into a joke that me and my friends all laughed about. You remember that time Emily was in the hospital? But then my friend Bruce died. He overdosed and died alone on his kitchen floor. He was there for 2 days before he was found. He was only 23 years old. I was in shock when I heard the news because Bruce was a good addict too. He was in college, he was a bartender, he knew how to handle his dose, he knew how to ride his high. So his death didn't make any sense. And then Brian and I broke up. Like so many other teenage romances, it ended with drama. Brian had been cheating with my best friend, and I caught them having sex. So Brian moved out of our house and moved in with her. In an instant, I lost my boyfriend of almost 9 years, my roommate, and my best friend. And I was completely lost. I didn't even know at that point how to function by myself. And there I was, sitting alone in what had been a cute little house. I kept using, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the relief I had always felt. And for the first time in my life, heroin was letting me down. I didn't feel beautiful. I didn't feel funny. I didn't feel sexy. I was a junkie. I was a loser. And I was 21 years old. I entered detox in January 1997. I decided to do a natural detox. I was under medical supervision to make sure I was safe. But the only thing that I was ever given was oxygen. To this day, my natural detox was the most painful experience of my life. I suffered bone and muscle aches, abdominal cramps, body shakes, muscle spasms, vomiting, diarrhea. Again, I could go on. It was horrible. Physically horrible, but the worst part of the entire detox was the emotions. I felt depression, anxiety, fear, rage, paranoia. And because of heroin, I hadn't felt anything for so many years that I was literally crushed under the weight of these feelings. The dope was out of my system in about 8 days, and I knew that I could never do a detox again, never. So I started seeing a psychiatrist. I'd never seen a psychiatrist before, and at first I was not a very willing participant. We had our 1-hour sessions twice daily, and the more we talked, the more of what he said started to make sense. And then he started using terms that I had never heard before. Terms like bipolar disorder, social anxiety disorder, SSRI. I started meds, and very, very slowly, I began to reflect on my life and my addiction. And for the first time, I had to start experiencing those feelings surrounding those things. That's when my abortion came up again. Over the years, I have heard abortion stories from so many women. Their stories have been tragic, heart-wrenching, powerful, empowering, and uplifting. But my abortion wasn't any of those. I have never sat in a dark room shoveling Ben & Jerry's New York Super Fudge chunk into my face while mourning my unborn child. I have never once reflected on who or what my child would be. I have never contemplated what my life would be like if I had carried that pregnancy to term. I don't feel regret about having my abortion. I don't feel shame about having my abortion. I don't feel embarrassment about having my abortion. What I do feel is gratitude. I am so grateful that I had the choice to terminate my pregnancy. I wasn't suddenly going to stop using because I was pregnant. I wasn't suddenly going to decide that I was going to plan for the future because I was pregnant. I wasn't going to decide I wanted to be a mother just because I was pregnant. My abortion allowed me to maintain the status quo of my life, despite how fucked up that status quo may have been. But it didn't change anything about the life I was living. Sobriety, though, it changed everything. My parents and I worked hard, and we rebuilt our relationship. In 2000, I earned a degree in English literature, and 2 years later, a degree in U.S. history. In 2003, I met Kevin. He is the love of my life and has been my partner for the past 16 years. These were important defining moments in my life. Defining moments that were only possible because of a seemingly inconsequential decision that I made to terminate my pregnancy in 1995. As my dear friend so eloquently says, not every abortion is a fucking Lifetime movie. Sometimes they're just a commercial. Thank you.